A new book is taking a critical look at America's war on drugs and its global impact. It is called Pills, Powder and Smoke: Inside the Bloody War on Drugs. The author, Antony Loewenstein, joins me now from Jerusalem. Good to see you. You started researching this book 4 years ago. Multiple countries later, it's published. What surprised you most about what you found?
Look, the reason I wrote the book, I think, was to challenge this misconception that because many US states have now legalised marijuana, because other countries have legalised pot, say Canada, Uruguay, and the fact that people often think that, for example, in Mexico the drug war is very vicious, that therefore the drug wars may be winding down in much of the world. But in fact what I found was the opposite. Because Western demand for drugs is so high that in countries like Honduras, West Africa, places that I visited on the ground, what you find is in fact that the dislocation, poverty, is in fact rising, and therefore because there's such a great demand in the West, the US, the UK and many Western countries for cocaine, heroin and other drugs, the reality is in fact the drug war remains vicious, and because drugs remain illegal there's a massive $500 billion annual trade. So that's what I was shocked about to report that on the ground around the world.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, the US, like many countries, but the US as a prime example, complains mightily about drug importation and the source countries. But, you know, is enough attention paid to demand? I mean, there wouldn't be the level of drug supply and importation if the demand for the product wasn't as strong. I think you wrote that Western demand for cocaine, for example, has never been stronger.
That's true. And in fact, for example, in the UK, there's evidence to suggest that in London alone, 23 kilograms of cocaine is consumed per day. I mean, the use of cocaine across Europe, across the UK, in the US is massive and growing. And the danger for that is not so much for me making a judgment of people who use cocaine, it's the fact that the purity is higher and people often are getting sicker because of using that kind of cocaine. And when you keep it illegal, no one knows what's in the drug. And the effect of the supply chain from the source countries, Colombia, for example, or Peru, the whole supply chain, the amount of misery along that supply chain is a problem. So the fact that we often don't look at why so many people in the West are using drugs, why they're so cheap now, I think causes dislocation in many communities. And in fact, in the US, for example, in the last few years, cocaine often is now mixed with fentanyl. And the effect of that can be that people often die or there's often hospitalisation. So until you legalise and regulate drugs, these problems are only going to get worse.
You know, another point that you make is the nexus between the drug trade and how lucrative it is and the immigration issues so much discussed by the Trump administration. I mean, many people, and you make this point, are fleeing Honduras, for example, where drug gang violence is rampant. And you've got this terrible irony of the drugs are headed for the US, the same destination as those fleeing the violence caused by the drugs.
Look, too often we don't look at this. And, I mean, Honduras is a classic case. I was there a few years ago investigating on the ground what that meant. I mean, Honduras is a narco-state. It's backed by the US. The president's brother was recently found guilty in the US of trying to import cocaine to the US from Honduras. And violence in that country is so high, the dislocation is so high, the effect is I've actually rarely been to a country where virtually everyone you speak to is desperate to leave, not because they hate Honduras, because they're desperate for a better life. And the demand for drugs in the US, because of that, causes people to flee. For example, most of the cocaine going from South America into the US goes via Honduras. So it's a transit country. The gang warfare is out of control. So when the US and Trump administration talks about curtailing immigration from Honduras or Guatemala, the question is not next asked, but why is Honduras a narco-state? Why is the US happy to support a narco-state there? And the answer is because the Honduran government says they're trying to stop immigrants leaving their own country, but not doing a very good job at it.
Yeah, exactly. I met a lot of those down on the Mexico-Guatemalan border on their way up to the US, and what they are fleeing is terrifying. Very quickly, because we're nearly out of time, but, you know, of course the world can't just surrender and say legalise everything, surely. You know, drugs legal for all and everything available without restriction. I mean, you can't imagine that.
It's not just me imagining it. I think the most logical way is that countries would start to legalise and regulate all drugs. The idea that ethically sourced drugs means what it sounds like. Everyone on the supply chain could potentially be treated ethically and, frankly, with justice and with a good wage. So, for example, rather than just legalising cannabis, you could also legalise cocaine. The reason why you would do that is you take the criminal networks out of the picture, which is a huge part of the problem. And, for example, just finally, if many countries which are moving towards legalising the use of LSD, mushrooms and ecstasy for mental health issues to deal with PTSD, we start normalising drugs, not to encourage people to use them, but to say that they can be treated in a normal, healthy way. So legalising and regulating drugs actually is a sensible future. And I think many countries will move towards that if we get past the rhetoric against and punishing those who use drugs normally and healthily.
Antony Loewenstein joining us there from Jerusalem. Thanks so much. Good to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you.